I thought the day I surprised my wife with plane tickets would be one of the proudest of my life. Instead, it was the day everything I believed about marriage shattered. We were at the airport, bags packed, passports ready. I had spent years saving, working overtime, saying no to myself so I could give Laura what she always dreamed of, a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Europe. Rome, Paris, Barcelona. I imagined her smile when she realized I'd planned it all. But the smile never came. Because when we reached the counter, the clerk pulled up our reservation, tilted her head, and said words that made my blood run cold. "Sir, I see a Laura Miller on this ticket, and a Dylan Carter. But no James Miller. My name wasn't there. My wife had a ticket. Her lover had a ticket. But me? I wasn't part of the plan." That was the moment my world flipped upside down. My name is James Miller, and this is the story of how my wife tried to erase me from her life at 30,000 feet, and how I turned her dream vacation into the nightmare she'll never escape. I wasn't born with much. My parents scraped by, and I learned early that if I wanted something, I'd have to build it brick by brick. I worked through college, skipped parties, stacked shifts. I built a steady career in project management, nothing glamorous, but enough to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. When I met Laura, she was dazzling. She had this spark that pulled people toward her. She laughed easily, lived loudly, and made the world feel brighter. I was quieter, steadier, the kind of man who believes in planning over chance. Somehow, we balanced each other. Or at least, I thought we did. From the start, she had dreams of traveling. "Someday, James," she'd say, showing me pictures of sunlit piazzas and cobblestone streets. "We'll go everywhere." I promised her we would, even if I didn't know how yet. So I saved. Every year, I put away a little. When bonuses came, I didn't splurge on gadgets or cars. I tucked them into a travel fund. I skipped vacations, passed on luxuries, because I wanted that one perfect trip, the one that would prove I had listened, that I had loved her enough to make her dream come true. And when the fund was finally big enough, I booked it all. Flights, hotels, tours. The works. I pictured her face lighting up as we strolled by the Eiffel Tower. I imagined us clinking glasses in Rome. It was supposed to be the trip that showed her just how much I still believed in us. But looking back now, I see the warning signs I ignored. The late nights at work. The new outfits she bought without explanation. The way her phone seemed to never leave her hand, screen turned away from me. At the time, I told myself she was just stressed, that after years of stability, she deserved some fun. That's what love does. It blinds you until betrayal cuts through the fog like a knife. And that knife found me at the airport, with the name Dylan Carter flashing on the screen where mine should have been. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene. I stood there, my heart pounding, my jaw clenched, and I looked at Laura. She smiled nervously, as if maybe she could explain her way out of it. But I already knew. She had been planning this for months. While I was counting pennies, she was counting down the days until she could disappear with him. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that I wasn't going to let her walk away laughing. If she thought she could humiliate me, steal from me, and build a new life on the ruins of mine, she had another thing coming. And as I walked away from that counter, I began building a plan. Not just for revenge, but for justice. Backhand index pointing right, and that's where I'll leave you for now. In part 2, I'll take you behind the curtain, how I uncovered just how far Laura and Dylan's betrayal really went, and how I quietly turned their dream vacation into their downfall. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, if you discovered your spouse had secretly booked a trip for themselves and their lover, would you confront them on the spot, or would you walk away and plot revenge? After the airport, I didn't confront Laura. I didn't throw her lies back in her face. I let her think she had me cornered, humiliated, powerless. Because that's exactly how she wanted it. And I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of watching me break. When we got home that night, she played it cool, claimed there'd been a mix-up, smiled like the woman I married, cooked dinner as if nothing had happened. But I'd seen the ticket. I'd seen his name where mine should have been. There's no mix-up in betrayal. So I stayed quiet. And I started digging. It began with the bank accounts. For years, I trusted her with finances. We had joint accounts, shared credit cards. I handled the big stuff, mortgage, insurance, savings. She managed day-to-day spending. It worked, or so I thought. But when I logged in that night, I saw the truth. Transfers I didn't recognize. Withdrawals in odd amounts. Always just under $1,000, enough to slip past my radar. And then I saw it. A separate savings account I hadn't opened. Laura's name on it. Not mine. And thousands of dollars sitting inside. Money siphoned from our life, redirected into hers. Or rather, theirs. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Charges for restaurants we never dined at. Hotel rooms in the city. Designer clothes I'd never seen her wear at home. It all painted a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Laura hadn't just been cheating on me in bed. She'd been cheating me out of the life I built. The next day, while she was at work, I checked her laptop. I knew her password. It hadn't changed in years. What I found nearly made me laugh, bitter as it was. Emails with Dylan. Love notes dressed up as logistics. Attachments with spreadsheets. A budget for their new life in Europe. They had it all planned. Rent for a flat in Barcelona. A startup fund to open a cafe, my money funding their dream. Even a note about selling our car behind my back once they left to squeeze out a little extra cash. Every email, every document, I copied to a flash drive. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because every lie she told, every dollar she stole, was another nail I was saving for the coffin of her perfect plan. I started watching her more closely. She thought she was subtle, late nights out, phone glued to her hand. But I noticed the way her smile lingered when she texted. I noticed the quick excuses when I asked about her day. And then came the kicker. One evening, she asked me to sign a document for taxes. She slid it across the table, casual as could be. But I've spent my life reading contracts, and something about the wording jumped out at me. It wasn't for taxes. It was a power of attorney form. If I'd signed it, she'd have been able to liquidate my accounts, sell my assets, even sign away the house. That's when I knew this wasn't just about love. It was about erasing me completely. But here's the thing about betrayal. It teaches you patience. I didn't call her out. I didn't rip up the paper in front of her. I smiled, told her I'd take a closer look tomorrow, and slipped it into my folder of evidence. That night, I lay in bed beside her, listening to her steady breathing. And I realized something. She thought she was the clever one. She thought I was blind, predictable, too devoted to ever notice. But I was awake now. And every move she made only tightened the noose she was weaving around her own neck. By the end of that week, I had a file thick with proof, bank transfers, receipts, emails, even the forged power of attorney. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it yet, but I knew this much. When the time came, Laura and Dylan wouldn't just lose me. They'd lose everything. And the sweetest part? They wouldn't even see it coming. Backhand index pointing right. That's where I'll stop for now. Because in part 3, I'll show you how I let Laura dig herself even deeper. How I gave her enough rope to hang both herself and her lover, all while smiling across the dinner table. Before we move on, let me ask you, would you have confronted her after finding the emails, or would you have waited like I did to let the trap close tighter? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. You ever smile at someone while secretly planning their downfall? That's exactly what I did with Laura. She thought she had me wrapped around her finger. But every time she lied, every time she spun another excuse, I was adding to the pile of evidence waiting to bury her. The first test came one Thursday night. Laura came home, exhausted from work, her perfume lingering in the air like she'd walked through someone else's cologne. She tossed her bag on the counter, kissed my cheek, and said she was going straight to bed. But her phone buzzed on the counter, and she forgot to lock it. Curiosity or survival instinct, I don't know which pushed me, but I picked it up. One glance at the screen, and my stomach clenched. Don't worry, baby. He's clueless. We'll be free soon. Dylan. I put the phone back before she noticed. I didn't need to read more. I already knew. The next morning, over pancakes, I decided to test her. Hey, Laura, I said casually. I've been thinking about taking some time off. Maybe we should go somewhere. Just the two of us. She froze for half a second, so quick most people wouldn't notice. But I did. Then she smiled too wide. Babe, you deserve a break. But things are so crazy at work right now. Maybe later this year? Her words said one thing. Her eyes said another. She had no intention of going anywhere with me. Not when she was planning her getaway with Dylan. So I nodded, smiled, and said, You're right. Later this year. But in my head, I was already laying the groundwork. I started moving money. Quietly, carefully. I opened a new account she didn't know about. Every week, I transferred small amounts from our joint account, just enough to look like bills or groceries. Slowly but surely, I built myself a safety net, one she couldn't touch. I also paid a visit to an old friend, Tony, a private investigator. I slid the folder of evidence across his desk, and his eyebrows climbed higher with every page. "James," he said, "this is already enough to ruin her. But if you want me to dig, I'll dig." And dig he did. Within 2 weeks, Tony had photos. Laura and Dylan at a hotel. Laura and Dylan holding hands at a cafe. Laura and Dylan shopping for furniture together. He even got a shot of them kissing in the parking lot, bold as could be. Every photo went into the growing file. But here's where I decided to twist the knife. Instead of avoiding Laura, I leaned into being the perfect husband. I brought her flowers. I cooked her favorite meals. I asked about her day, even feigned interest in her stories. She must have thought I was desperate, that I was clinging harder because I felt her slipping away. The truth? I was feeding her confidence, making her believe she had me fooled. And the more secure she felt, the sloppier she became. One night, she left her laptop open again. This time, I didn't just copy emails. I found a shared folder, hers and Dylan's. Inside were scanned copies of my IDs, bank account info, even the deed to our house. My blood ran cold. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning to erase me, to strip everything I owned and walk away clean. That was the moment my revenge crystallized. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to make sure they lost everything, each other included. So I kept playing dumb. I let her plan dinners she couldn't make. I let her cancel our date nights. I let her laugh at her phone while I sat across the room pretending not to notice. And all the while, I was pulling strings behind the scenes, tightening the noose with every move she made. Because when the mask finally came off, Laura wouldn't just lose me. She'd lose her lover, her money, her reputation, her entire illusion of control. Backhand index pointing right, that's where I'll pause. Because in part 4, I'll reveal how I set the stage for the perfect trap, one that would force Laura and Dylan into the open, with no escape. But let me ask you this. If you found undeniable proof your spouse was plotting to rob you blind, would you confront them right away, or would you let them dig their own grave? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious. There's a difference between catching someone in the act and letting them fall into the act. The first satisfies a fist-punched, animal part of you. The second is surgical. I wanted surgical. I wanted a moment so clean that there would be no room for their spin, no place for pity to hide them. So I built a trap that looked like a life. Normal, boring, full of petty domestic motions. While behind the wallpaper, I rewired everything. The first wire I pulled was financial and blunt. I wasn't reckless. I was deliberate. I called the bank the morning after I found the scanned deed in their shared folder. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I spoke as a calm, annoyed customer who preferred not to be surprised. Place a watch on any transfers over $500 from our joint account, I said. And contact me if a new account is opened in my name or if any power of attorney paperwork is submitted. They asked questions I expected, and I answered with dull, practiced tones. The customer service rep put me through to fraud prevention, and in 24 hours, the bank flagged our accounts. It didn't freeze them. I wasn't ready for that. Freezing alerts them and provokes. I wanted an umbrella of monitoring that would pounce when the right step was taken. Next came the paperwork. Priya, my attorney, filed a preservation notice quietly with the county clerk. It wasn't dramatic to the outside world, just 2 pages stamped and recorded, but it told the universe that if anyone tried to move property or accounts, we'd see it and litigate. Lawyers love paper because paper lasts. The deed scan they'd stored in a folder became less a secret and more a potential torch. I tightened the personal side, too. I moved my hidden savings into a completely separate bank under a name Laura didn't recognize and transferred titles to items she could never touch without my signature present. Little things, legally safe, but moving parts she'd counted on. If she tried to sell the car, she'd discover the title was not where she thought. If she tried to access the savings, she'd find the account empty. Those doors would click shut at the wrong moment. Then I put my quiet army in place. Tony, the PI, didn't just take photos. He started following Dylan to places Dylan thought private. He taped conversations in public spaces where both Claire and Dylan had no expectation of privacy. He spoke to delivery drivers, apartment managers, and the mail receiving service attached to the P.O. box they used. He tracked patterns. He knew which nights Dylan stayed over, and when they used the boutique's warehouse to receive packages of furniture and household goods they intended to ship to Spain. He timed everything to my readiness. We also cultivated witnesses, people whose names mean very little on their own but, when combined, create a chorus that drowns out excuses. The assistant who'd reused the invoice template was ready to sign an affidavit. The delivery driver would record a sworn statement about addresses. A vendor who'd been stiffed for months agreed to testify that Claire had requested that a shipment be diverted to Dylan's apartment. None of these were sensational individually. Together they formed the kind of corroboration courts and banks respect. The next move was theatrical in its mundanity. I booked a last-minute overnight at a nearby hotel, nothing fancy, and invited friends to meet me there on the pretense of a weekend away. Claire assumed I was trying to reconnect. She was wrong, of course. I wanted her to feel normal, to believe the old James who forgave and smiled had returned. I wanted her comfortable when the panic came. The night we left, I did something else. I told my sister, who lived across town, to be on call. I told Luke's school I'd be reachable, arranged for his schedule to stay consistent, and asked our neighbor to pick up the mail. The logistics were meant to keep my son safe and the house bland. No sudden moves, no suspicion. I did not want Claire to smell the trap. While we were away, Tony staged a chance encounter with Dylan. It was a small thing. Tony happened to be walking his dog past Dylan's building, and there he was staggering in with bags of expensive things. Tony snapped photos. He also handed a discreet business card to Dylan's doorman. He wanted to be available without making Dylan paranoid. The psychological trick here was to show that someone was paying attention, that ease could be an illusion. The next morning, I forgot my wallet at the hotel desk. I asked Claire to drive back home to fetch a charger I'd left. She took the bait. Dylan's apartment key fit right in her pocket. While she was gone, I called the bank back and gave them a carefully worded instruction. If any unusual withdrawal or new account was attempted in my name in the next 48 hours, hold it and contact my attorney. I didn't ask them to freeze everything, because that could force their hand. I wanted patience and leverage. I also called the mail receiving service attached to the P.O. box. I told them, under the pretense of a friendly check-in, that I'd be calling in the coming days on behalf of my wife to confirm deliveries. It gave the courier a legal pretext to hand Tony a signed note if a package came for Dylan. Tony had coordinated this. It was small theater with big teeth. When Claire returned to the house, she wore the same lightness as before. She laughed in the kitchen, kissed me hello, and left a note that said she'd be back later, maybe after Dylan had come by. She had no sense of the net already tightening around her. In the afternoon, Tony called. He'd intercepted a delivery. The invoice matched the one that had been mistakenly billed to the vendor, furniture addressed to Dylan's apartment. There were receipts where the billing name matched the P.O. box service. Tony had the delivery driver ready to sign a statement putting the goods in Dylan's hands and evidence that the marketing vendor invoices led to demonstrable personal purchases. The paper trail was now flesh and voice. The bank had the flags. The lawyer had the preservation order. I had witnesses. I could have moved then. I could have sprung a public scene. I could have torn apart their lives then and there. But I wanted theater with a verdict, not a viral freakout that gave them the chance to spin words into pity. I wanted a moment that would be impossible to explain away. So I pulled another thread. I contacted the boutique's largest supplier, one who maintained careful records, and asked them for copies of deliveries in the last 3 months. The owner, a blunt man named Jorge, was hurt and hungry for fairness. He'd been stiffed and embarrassed. He provided invoices, dates, and the signatures on delivery receipts. The receipts bore the same handwriting that appeared on the fake invoices I'd found. Jorge agreed to meet and to corroborate the dates and amounts in a signed affidavit. The chain of custody of evidence was becoming visible. It was no longer a secret in my hand. It was a public ledger. Next, I set a social net. I called one of Dylan's friends, someone I'd known in college, and asked him to drop by the cafe Dylan often used. It was a small favor. Sit there and be available if Dylan decided to call friends bragging about the exit strategy. That friend agreed to text me any suspicious messages. When Dylan did brag to another friend about the perfect plan to get to Europe and start a cafe using the seed money, the friend recorded it and agreed to testify. Men brag in private far more loudly than they speak in public. It's a kind of arrogance you can harvest. I also prepared Luke's schedule. I moved piano lessons and soccer practice to times that would make it awkward, legally and morally, for Claire to abandon her child in the middle of a scheme. One of the cruelest things they could do was expose our son to the fallout. I would not let that happen. If their plan required leaving Luke, their story would be harder to sell. I made sure their moral scripts would crack under scrutiny. A final piece of the net was social exposure. I seeded a quiet rumor to a reporter I trusted, someone who knew both our family and how to handle delicate stories. Not a smear, an inquiry. There are vendor payment issues and a travel booking anomaly. Nothing concrete yet. I said, if the reporter dug, and reporters always dig, there would be another set of eyes, and perhaps a gentle nudge in the direction of public accountability once the legal papers were filed. Everything lined up the way I intended. On the third day, while Claire and Dylan thought they were slipping through a hole we'd left, they made a stupid choice. Emboldened, they decided to take a trial run, a weekend where they'd check out the first leg of their escape. My men, Tony and the friend in the cafe, were watching. The driver had recorded the signature. The bank had a pending alert. Priya had a court ticket prepped, not yet filed, but ready. It was like waiting for someone to pull a lever. They pulled the lever. Dylan attempted to transfer a large sum from our joint savings into an offshore account he'd had prearranged. It was the first transaction big enough to break the bank's threshold and trigger the watch I'd set. The compliance officer called Priya. Priya called Tony. Tony called me. For them, the world narrowed in a way that looked ordinary. A phone ringing, a polite voice from a bank, a recorded hold music. For me, the world tightened like an instrument, sound nuanced and precise. The bank halted the transfer. They put a required verification step in place. They requested additional IDs and a notarized request. The transfer could not proceed without both of us present. In their arrogance, Claire and Dylan had assumed that paperwork was theatrical. They'd tried to bypass it. They'd overlooked a simple truth. Real money moves in the daylight and needs signatures that can't be forged in a long enough time without leaving footprints. And yet, in that small victory, I felt something unexpected, pity. Maybe not for them, but for the version of Claire I once loved, someone who'd let greed rewrite her beyond redemption. That moment softened the edges of the rage. I was still angry, but there was also a clear-minded sadness that made the next steps feel less like vengeance and more like necessary correction. We were still not done. The transfer being stopped was tactical, not final. It bought time and created a paper trail. Attempted transfer, blocked by bank on compliance grounds. Investigation opened. That is the kind of language prosecutors love. It shows intent. It shows movement. We readied the public move. Priya filed the injunction to preserve assets that afternoon. The court stamped it. The judge's clerk sent notice to both parties. It felt anticlimactic. A piece of paper, a small formality, but the sound it made in reality was legal gears engaging. The judge's order prevented them from selling or transferring any major asset and required that records be preserved and made available. They were trapped in a way they couldn't charm away. The net was in place. The witnesses were next. The press had a soft lead. The bank had its flags. The only thing remaining was the moment when a man who decided he owned other people's lives would have to explain himself in the light. I had one more private move to make before the public scene. There was a small, sentimental box of Laura's mother's things, photos, a locket she cherished. Instead of burning something she loved or breaking it, I wrote a note and put it back in the box. The note said simply, "You chose the life you wanted. Remember what you left behind." I left it where she would find it before we made our final steps public. It wasn't cruelty. It was currency, an emotional punctuation before the legal period. That night, as I walked Luke to bed and read him a story about a brave knight who does the hard thing because it protects others, I felt the weight shift. The trap was set, and the only remaining question was how they'd fall. In part 5, I'll show you the court, the press, the moment they try to spin, and the way the ledger and the witnesses breathe life into truth. I'll show you what happens when people who thought themselves clever find themselves suddenly, artlessly, exposed. Because truth has a way of being merciless, and I was ready for that mercilessness. Before I go, one line. Would you rather see cheaters publicly humiliated or quietly handled through legal channels? Say public or private. I read them all. The day the world learned who Laura really was started like any other. I watched the sunrise from our front porch, a mug of coffee cooling in my hands, while Luke chased a wayward soccer ball across the yard. The morning was ordinary. Birds, neighborly waves, the small, stubborn normalcy I had fought to protect. That normalcy was the point of everything I'd done. If the world was going to watch the reveal, it would see a father standing steady, not a man undone. The first knock came just after 9. A reporter from the local paper had been told the hearing would be open to the public. He asked if I'd make a brief statement afterwards. I agreed to 3 lines: facts, caution, and 1 sentence about the child. No drama, no jagged anger into microphones. The rest would come in the courtroom. Priya and I arrived early. The courthouse smelled like coffee and old files, comforting in its own way. We filed into the small hearing room, which sat maybe 30 people if you counted the standing space. That's where I wanted it. I didn't need thousands. I wanted an audience that could read the faces of the people who would later try to act indifferent. The hearing began with formalities. The judge, a blunt woman who moved like she had better things to do than drama, listened as Priya laid out the petition for preservation and the emergency request to prevent any asset transfers. She presented the bank's compliance log, attempted transfers, flagged wires, timestamps that showed Dylan's attempt to move funds right after Claire had scheduled a notarized consultation that should have allowed joint account access. Then Tony read from the delivery driver's affidavit, packages addressed to Dylan's apartment, signatures on receipts, dates matching vendor invoices. Jorge, the supplier, handed the judge a binder of invoices and a sworn statement. The handwriting matched the templates the assistant had mistakenly used. Aaron, the forensic accountant, explained the routing of dollars from our joint accounts into shell accounts and personal purchases, step by forensic step. The judge did what I'd hoped she would do. She read the evidence with a clinician's patience. She asked questions that had nothing to do with pity, only with fact. "Where is the deed?" she asked Priya. "Has there been any transfer?" Priya handed over copies. "Bank." The compliance officer answered. "We initiated a hold pending verification. Notarized paperwork." Priya slid a copy of the scanned power of attorney, and the forensic metadata showed it had been emailed from Dylan's address, an ugly trail. When the clerk called Claire's name, she stood pale and practiced. She had practiced for cameras before, smiling, petitioning for sympathy, but this was not a camera set. Her hands trembled in a way no filter can fix. Ethan, Dylan, sat beside her, eyes darting. He had no script left. You can feel when a person's performance is over. Their face loses its public shape and becomes a private geography of panic. The defense tried to recast everything as misunderstanding. "We were planning," the lawyer said. "There were business ambitions, misapplied accounting, but no intent to defraud." Claire spoke in a small voice about feeling trapped, about a marriage that drifted. She offered the old plea. "I made a mistake." Dylan muttered apologies that were not for me, but for being caught. Pity, the kind they both hoped would soften the room, tends to be public and short-lived. It doesn't erase bank logs, signed receipts, or delivery drivers willing to stand under oath. When Tony read the delivery receipts aloud, then handed the judge a photo of Dylan carrying a lamp into his apartment, you could hear a pin drop. When Aaron explained the pattern, round trips of money through shell entities, personal purchases coded as marketing, the language was clinical, cold, and devastating. The judge leaned forward once and said, "This appears to be not merely poor bookkeeping, but a coordinated effort to divest a spouse while creating the appearance of legitimate expenditures." Those words landed like a physical thing in the room. After the judge announced a temporary preservation order and set a date for a full evidentiary hearing, the courtroom emptied into the corridor like a flock of birds scattering. Reporters clustered like they always do, worried about angles, eager for sound bites. I did what I promised. I walked to the microphone and said 3 calm sentences. "We pursued the law because it was the only way to protect what matters, my son and the life we built. There's no glory in this. There is only returning things to where they belong." I paused. I asked for privacy for Luke. He did not ask for any of this. The cameras flashed anyway. The headlines appeared in an hour. Local wife and lover accused of fraud. Dream vacation turns into legal nightmare. Social media did its thing. People polarized, some quick to demonize, others to wonder about nuance. But the facts were now public. When the bank's compliance officer confirmed the attempted transfer and the judge's order came down, the narrative shifted from gossip to evidence. The fallout was immediate and precise. Vendors publicly demanded payment. Investors and friends who had been on the fence now made their positions clear. The boutique's largest clients pulled their sponsorships. Claire's glittering social circle thinned like fog under heat. Dylan lost a few freelance accounts as clients distanced themselves. One contact, embarrassed to have ever introduced him for a startup idea, texted suggesting they had nothing more to do with him. The community I'd once thought would be silent started to move. Not with malice, but with accountability. They tried a counterplay. At one point, Carlisle, an acquaintance of Dylan's who liked to stir, floated a story that the whole thing was a money argument blown out of proportion by a spurned husband. It didn't stick. Why? Because when you have receipts, signatures, timestamps, delivery confirmations, spin becomes a thin, useless fabric next to the concrete. The most brutal exposure happened a week later when an array of emails and photos Tony had captured were published in a local outlet with journalism that cared about facts. There was the scanned apartment lease in both Laura and Dylan's names. There were pictures of them in cafes designed to look like romantic getaways. There were the invoices that listed my account number as the origin for transfers. People read. People reacted. People I'd called friends unfriended them somewhere in their hearts. Dylan called me once during that week, voice raw. "James, please, this is bigger than us. We can fix it. I can pay them back." He sounded like a man who thought money could buy absolution. I listened. He begged. He made offers that sounded foolish to the ear now. Promises he couldn't fulfill, offers of labor and apology. I told him, calmly, something I'd been rehearsing. You can't fix what you broke by buying it back. You can only start to become honest. I didn't say the part one felt. That honesty came too late to rescue the trust they'd smashed. Legal processes moved on a schedule slower than emotion, but steadier. Subpoenas went out, depositions were taken, and auditors spent days in our house and in Claire's boutique. There were moments of petty cruelty. A nosy neighbor asked Luke's teacher if divorce papers had been filed. There were moments of solemnity. An old supplier showed up at my door with a check, half the amount I'd asked, and a quiet apology and a note. Use this for your son. Those gestures mattered because they were honest rather than performative. At trial, the prosecution's case was surgical. Aaron walked the jury through the financial wiring like a conductor moving an orchestra, every instrument playing its part for the same dissonant song. Tony's photos and the delivery driver's sworn testimony were played like a slide presentation of betrayal. Claire's emails, where she instructed vendors to bill differently and discussed the plan with Dylan, read plainly into the microphone. Dylan's callousness, his references to the seed money and a fresh start, cut the edges of any sympathy. The defense tried to claim desperation, immaturity, a moment of moral collapse. It did not work the way they hoped. The jury took hours, not days. When the verdict came, guilty on counts of fraud and conspiracy and guilty on the civil claims to restitution, I felt relief that was not triumph so much as a simple aligning of the scales. Justice, in a way, is not entertainment, it is correction. Sentencing came with a complicated ache. Claire pleaded for leniency, spoke of regret. The judge sentenced them to a combination of restitution, significant sums to be paid back over time, and a period of community service, plus a sentence that included a suspended jail term dependent on repayment attempts. Dylan received a harsher portion of the sentence. He had been the one who'd engineered offshore routes and had been explicit in emails about the plan. Money was ordered returned where possible, and assets that had been purchased with misrouted funds were seized. But money does not fully fix what was taken. The community's trust, the intimate betrayal, the hollow look on Luke's face the first time a classmate asked if his parents were getting a divorce. Those things don't have receipts. They require time, presence, and stubborn, honest effort to rebuild. I rebuilt. Slowly. I sold the boutique's remaining inventory back to vendors at cost and rehired a manager from our old network to run what would become a different store, one grounded in field honesty, not glossy promises. I took time off work to be with Luke. We planted a small vegetable plot in the backyard, literal roots and literal patience. Friends reappeared, not all of them, but the ones who mattered did. They didn't act like nothing had happened. They simply showed up. There were hard choices, too. When the judge offered the chance to pursue criminal contempt for the assistant who'd facilitated invoicing, I declined. I wanted people responsible, yes, but I also wanted any justice to be proportional. I wanted closure, not a catalog of petty punishments. Vindictiveness is easy, discernment is harder. Months later, on a bright spring morning, I walked Luke to school and watched him run to his friends. He laughed, whole and unguarded, and that sound steadied me in a way no courtroom could. Some people asked if I felt satisfied. I told them the truth. I felt vindicated, yes, but more importantly, I felt free. Free not because I had hurt them back, but because I had chosen to stop being defined by their betrayal. There were moments of sweetness in the ruin of their life. Dylan, who had once sneered at the ordinary life as something to escape, now did odd jobs under the names he'd once mocked. The humility of a man learning the price of his choices. Claire signed up for therapy as part of her restitution demands. Whether she changed is not for me to decide. I protected Luke from the ugly details. I did not gloat. I rebuilt. People ask me if I ever thought about revenge that burned brighter, something dramatic that would make them disappear from our town's memory forever. The answer is no. The anger I held was a tool, not the destination. My aim had never been to torch a life so much as to place truth where lies had been. That's what justice does. It clears the air so what's left can grow. So what did I keep, and what did I burn? I burned the illusions, photos of a marriage that had been a performance, trinkets she'd bought with money that wasn't ours, the small things that had become shrine-like in their hypocrisy. I kept the things that mattered. Luke's drawings, a letter I'd written him about courage, the faint scratch on the kitchen table where he'd carved his name when he was 5. Those things are real. They are not glossy. They are ours. Weeks later, when the press had moved on to the next scandal and the courtroom papers had gathered dust, I stood in the kitchen and watched Luke mix cereal. He looked up and grinned. "Dad, when can we go to the beach again?" he asked. My travel fund was smaller now. My plans had shifted. But I looked at him and saw everything I had saved the fight for. "Soon," I said, and meant it. The promise wasn't about a vacation. It was about the future. It was about proving, to myself and to him, that life after betrayal could be ordinary and beautiful and whole in a way that no scheme could buy. Revenge, if you must have a name for it, was simply the act of returning my son to a life where his father was present and honest. Everything else, the money, the headlines, the public humiliation of two people who had once been close to us, was a byproduct of choosing truth over theatrics. The final thing I did was sign a document that morning. A simple agreement that made the restoration official and that placed any remaining disputed assets into a supervised trust for Luke's benefit. It protected his childhood from the last of their greed. It was legalese, formal and small, but a real, clean stroke that closed the loop. As I left the attorney's office, the sun was warm and the world smelled like cut grass. It felt ordinary, and I loved ordinary. I liked the way it required no drama, no performance. I liked that the most meaningful revenge had been to keep living, straightforwardly, honestly, with my son by my side. If you ever find yourself betrayed by the people you trust most, remember this. The public exposure can be brutal, yes, and sometimes necessary. But it is not an end in itself. It is a clearing. What comes after, the slow rebuilding, the small acts of care, defines who you are long after the headlines stop printing their names. I kept Luke. I kept my dignity. I kept the life that mattered most. They kept the memory of what they chose. That, in the end, is enough.